Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the JMO podcast. I'm your host, Tayler Michels, and on this episode, we've got Jason Mitchell. If you've been following along on social medias or YouTube, you've known Jason's had a pretty productive season so far. Recently put out a great video catching big walleyes on weed lines in the Devil's Lake area using slip bobbers. This podcast, I asked Jason all about bottom bouncer fishing. The bottom bouncer and spinnerbite is heating up in the surrounding area as we speak, so I figured no better topic to talk to Jason about. We talk a little bit about the origin story of this technique, all the way on up to gear, line, hook selection, everything you need to know about bottom bouncer fishing with Jason Mitchell on this week's podcast. Well, Jason, you and I spent a fair amount of time together. That being said, anybody that keeps track of social media or just knows you in general knows you've been fishing quite a bit. There's been, the bite's been up and down with some weather, but you've produced some great videos already this year, open water. And that being said, though, your home body of water, Devil's Lake, I just want to cut right to the chase here and ask you, what are some of the great summertime patterns that you look forward to on Devil's Lake each year?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different things, and the beauty about Devil's Lake is that there's a lot of things that work, and you can kind of pick your poison. Obviously, you've got the slip bobber patterns where you're running slip bobbers on, say, weed lines or in flooded timber. There's also some great shallow patterns that, hold true on Devil's Lake for long portions of the summer where people are throwing plastics or swim baits or crankbaits, pitching up shallow. And, then there's obviously the deep stuff, jigging deep rock piles, for example, pulling lead core, running bottom bouncers. And what's funny is that, when the lake was coming up fast, we had so many flooded trees to deal with and so many snags that slip bobbers really became a prominent pattern all summer. And when the water started to stabilize, the weed growth really came back. And so as the weed growth is really came back on Devil's Lake over, say, the last 10 years, then we've seen that bottom bouncer and spinner pattern really start to shine because, the fish are, in a lot of cases, relating to the weeds more than they are the flooded timber.
I find it really entertaining to bring up the past, the history of a body of water like Devil's Lake. There's also a lot to learn from it, too, just to look back and see what has been. You look at how Devil's Lake as a fishery really evolved in the last 20, 30 years with the water coming up and all the changes that have been made to the landscape there and that ecosystem. But also, you look at the fishing industry as a whole in the last 20, 30 years has really evolved. So different methods and things ways of catching fish have really come a long way, but also the lake itself in that same time frame. So just really interesting to me. So I guess my question would be for you, your perspective on that. What are some of the, the old tried and true methods in the days of old that have kind of been eclipsed by evolution and where we're at now?
Well, it's always revolving, and sometimes what's old is new. I mean, back in the day before Devil's Lake was high, and pulling crankbaits underneath the algae blooms. People would just drive around in a circle out on the main bay with downriggers, catching big fish. Then the water came up, and the lake tripled in size. Well, then we had all these flooded trees. And, I remember the Minnewacan Flats was like the Garden of Eden. There's just so many trees in the water. They still had their leaves on them. And then obviously a few years later, all those trees were dead. And it changed a lot where we were fishing a lot of flooded trees, a lot of flooded brush. And then a lot of those trees got knocked over. I mean, we don't have 10% of the trees that we used to. We used to have so many trees standing in the water, and now they're all gone for the most part, or a big percentage of them are gone. There's still places where there's stumps and stuff, in the lake. But, it's changed. And so it's kind of almost gone back to how it used to be where, if you were to fish Devil's Lake, say 30 years ago, you might be saying what's called Old Mill Bay or Budweiser Bay or Wolford's Bay, pitching shallow weed lines with a shallow running crankbait. It's kind of gone back to that same tactics, same things are still applying, but we're getting back to the weeds. That's been going on for quite a while. It's not like just the last year or two, but I would say the last 10 years, as the lake's more stabilized, or even in some cases, some seasons it's dropped. It really has become more of a weed pattern. But, obviously weeds aren't the only game in town. You've got rock piles, you've got, transitions and contours. Beauty about summertime on Devil's Lake is you can catch fish from 3 feet to 35 feet, or deeper if you wanted to. And you can fish, variety of different structure, variety of different patterns from one end of the lake to the other. I mean, there's so many different ways you can catch fish right now.
This might be debatable, but it sure seems like a bottom bouncer and spinner presentation accounts for more walleyes, or at least just as many walleyes as any other presentation on Devil's Lake. Throughout the open water fishing season. What's your take on that? I mean, what are you looking for coming out of spring? What are the conditions that you're looking for when we're transitioning into that bottom bouncer and spinner bite?
Well, the thing about bottom bouncers is they're so versatile. You can start. I typically start running bottom bouncers a lot as we get into June. Especially when the fish are say 6-7 feet of water or deeper. And the thing about bottom bouncers is that like Devil's Lake, we've talked about earlier. With all the flooded trees and stuff, there's also rock piles and rock edges and things like that. And so for weed lines, rock piles, it's just staying on a contour, staying on structure. Bottom bouncers are a phenomenal tool for just keeping your bait in the zone. I mean, typically Devil's Lake, the water has some stain in it. As we get later on in the summer, the water gets even more greener from the algae blooms. And as a typical rule of thumb, those fish are, fairly close to the bottom. And a bottom bouncer is a perfect tool for just keeping your presentation right where it needs to be. You can speed up, you can slow down, you can slide up a little shallower, you can drop down a little deeper. It doesn't matter. You just have that piece of, this L wire with a piece of lead on it that just keeps your spinner or snell, whatever you're using, just right off bottom in front of those fish. And so I think that's why bottom bouncers are so effective. Not just Devil's Lake. I mean, they really originated out of the Missouri River system. So they're kind of I guess what you call a North Dakota, South Dakota staple. Whether it's Lake Hawaii or Lake Sakakawea. I believe Bob Meter in Bismarck, North Dakota, is he's been credited as, the person that invented the bottom bouncer. But, and obviously it's used all over the country now at this point, but just a very effective, simple tool.
So, when you first start out in June, like what are the water temps that you're looking for, or should I say, what are the conditions that you're looking for when you want to start pulling your bottom bouncers? And when you start out, what does your bottom bouncer setup look like? I mean, is it short snells, long snells, or is it, a bead and a minnow, a spinner? Do you let the fish kind of tell you what they want? I mean, how do you start that out early in bottom bouncing season, and how does that progress through the summer?
Well, there's no written code that you have to follow. I basically start out with bottom bouncers whenever I need to cover water, whenever the fish will stay below the boat. Whether it's, I've had times where I've pulled bottom bouncers below the boat in 5 feet of water in the middle of summer with 80-degree surface temps and an algae bloom, and the fish would let me drive over the top of them without spooking. Early in the year, as a general thumb, when that water's still cold and a lot of times it clears up, those fish won't let you drive right over the top of them. You have to cast to them. But as soon as, those fish get, 6, 7, 8 feet of water or deeper, and they'll let me drive the boat over the top of them. And especially if I got to cover water to find fish and just break down water, a bottom bouncer is a phenomenal tool. And obviously, when you throw cover into the, you can also throw crankbaits in that situation as well. But when you have cover or, really tight contours, things that you really have to stick to and follow to catch fish, obviously, running bottom bouncers, right below the boat is a lot easier way to stay on structure. And so for weed lines in particular, I can't tell you how many times where inside of the boat, in between the boat and the weed line, that those rods caught every fish in the boat. You could only get one side of the boat on fish at a time because those fish are holding so tight right on a weed line edge, and you can just run bottom bouncers right along that edge. And so just to really, especially with the weed lines at Devil's Lake, I would say if there's just one presentation all summer long that's just going to be the most consistent, you find that outside weed line on Devil's Lake, and it might be in 8 feet of water in some areas, 6 feet of water in some parts of the lake, or it might be, closer to 10, 11, 12 feet in other areas. You just run a bottom bouncer and trace that outside edge of that weed line, you're going to catch all kinds of fish.
So, Jason, what would you say it is about bottom bouncers and spinners that is becoming so popular? Is it just something that's easy for people to do or easy to grasp? Is it that effective? It's obviously some combination of both. But when you look back on history, what's your perspective on the growing popularity of pulling bottom bouncers?
In the early days when we first started guiding on Devil's Lake, we weren't using bottom bouncers a lot because there was so much flooded timber and flooded trees that we really had to resort to pitching or using slip bobbers. And then once the fish pulled out deeper than the flooded trees, then a lot of times it was big spots, big contours, where we're doing a lot of contour trolling with crankbaits. And so I would say, the bottom bouncer really became, it seemed like more popular on Devil's Lake over the last 10 years, or at least it became popular again because as the lake stabilized, or at least somewhat stabilized, where it wasn't coming up 4, 5, 3 feet every year, and those weed lines got to really develop and take off, that outside edge of the weed line, in some cases inside edge of the weed line, really became a big part of the puzzle for just location for finding fish. And, you take weed lines, whether it's a prominent point or just a short line with a nice lip and nice drop off on it, where you have a nice defined edge on a weed line, running bottom bouncers and spinners is just so incredibly effective.
That's great information. Let's talk specifically equipment now. What does your bottom bouncer and spinner setup look like? I mean, how are you fishing them? How are you fishing your gear? Do you have a specific setup that makes you comfortable with them? Especially if you have more than one person in the boat, so you've got, those extra lines. North Dakota, 2 lines per person. Talk about your setup specifically and how you like to run them. Any tips for that?
Well, I like to run pretty stiff rods. A lot of times I'm running a bait casting rod and reel setup. A lot of times a 7-foot bait casting rod is my favorite, like a medium heavy action. And I like to use those heavier actions, especially if the rod's in the rod holder, because especially when you're going through rock, if that rod tip kind of loads up and bogs down every time that bottom bouncer loads up and hits a snag, you just seem to get buried in the snags. But if you have a really stiff rod, you'll see that rod load up, and then the rod will kind of pop that bottom bouncer out of the snag. And so I like to use a 7-foot medium heavy action bait casting rod, and just, as a rule of thumb, 1 ounce of lead, 1 ounce bottom bouncer for every 10 feet of water. So if you're in 10 feet, use 1 ounce. If you're in 20 feet, use a 2 ounce bottom bouncer. And that'll keep your line at about a 45-degree angle from the rod tip to the water. And that keeps your bottom bouncer and your presentation fairly close to what you're seeing on your electronics as far as what's in the cone angle below the boat. And just a bait casting reel. If you're holding the rod, having a bait casting reel with a flipping switch is really nice. If you have the rods and rod holders, especially like when we're guiding, having a small, compact, low profile line counter reel is really handy to have. Just so that, like, say the people in the front of the boat, they might have, say, 15 feet of line out. You're going along in, say, 9 feet of water, and the people in the back can let their lines out to, say, 19 or 20 feet, so you just keep everything from getting tangled up. And, it's really that's probably the beauty of this, is that, if you ever have to take your, members of your family out, friends, people from work, maybe your kids, whatever, that don't get to fish a lot, you can really catch a lot of fish with the bottom bouncer and spinner. You don't have to have necessarily the touch or the feel. When you're on the bottom, and it's just, and the fish hit hard. It's just an incredibly fun way to catch fish. And as a rule of thumb, I like to run bottom bouncers, kind of fast. I mean, I like to cover water and, trigger fish. So, slow might be, say, 1.25 miles an hour. I'll pull them all the way up to 2 miles an hour. Probably say an average speed is probably 1.5 miles. But, especially if you're missing fish, don't be afraid to speed up. A lot of times, I think, if anything, people go too slow with them.
The JMO podcast is sponsored by Long Haul Trucking. Long Haul's always looking for more skilled professional CDL drivers to join their team. They're a people-first company, and it shows. Their employee-owned, asset-based fleet of over 350 Conestogas is among industry leaders in pay and benefits geared towards long-term success and growth for company drivers and owner-operators. If you're a professional driver or a company that wants to ship product with the best in the business, get a hold of Long Haul at 1-800-255-5153 or find them online at longhaultrucking.com. Long Haul, running on the power of promises kept. And you look at just how flexible and diverse the presentations can get with that. That bottom bouncer is just kind of a funny thing when it's sitting on the shelf, right? It's just a wire with some lead melted to it, but it really can create a lot of variety of presentations. So for you, when you go out and you're going to run bottom bouncers and spinners all day, I mean, how big is your tackle box? What all are you throwing on them lines to find out what the fish are looking for?
Well, I mean, it can be as simple as just a 4-foot snell and a plain hook. I mean, it can be that simple. And a lot of times, just a plain snell can be really underrated as far as how effective it can be. Especially you get situations where maybe you have no wind and you have maybe after a really bad cold front. There's times where less is more. Where just a 4 to 6 foot plain snell with a plain hook and maybe a night crawler or minnow leech, whatever you're using. That catch fish anywhere. But from that, then a lot of times people add beads, they'll add floats, just for a little bit of more color. Then obviously you've got the spinner harnesses. I've really gotten big on like prop rigs, which are a little bit more subtle than a traditional spinner harness. And what I like about them is they'll turn at slower speeds, and so like when you go around corners, especially, your blades keep turning, your prop keeps turning to where it keeps up off the bottom and out of the snakes and out of the debris and slime and stuff on the bottom. And so like Northland's got a butterfly blade that's really, really big. Then you've got like the Max blades, Smile blades. That type of stuff is really effective. And then obviously you've got the traditional spinner harnesses, like whether it's a 2-hook crawler harness or just a single hook, just a in North Dakota, South Dakota especially, even a lot of the inland water in Minnesota and Wisconsin, just a deep cup Colorado blade, is kind of a classic. And obviously the staple is pulling night crawlers behind these spinner harnesses, 2 hooks, and then the last few years, last 10 years I suppose, the gulp and some of the I guess what you call synthetic baits, the soft plastic baits have gotten big. And so especially midsummer on, I'm a really big believer in using gulp on the harnesses, especially 'cause it's more durable. The perch don't peck it off. You don't have to worry about junk fish pecking it off. And a lot of times I find that I catch bigger fish, running, artificials versus the live baits.
So the nuance of bottom bounce fishing, I mean, that's all such great information, Jason. Let's talk a little bit about, or expand more on how you fish them. I mean, going back to your guiding career as well as, fishing tournaments, I mean, they're just, catching walleyes, the bottom bouncers can do the job. But when you're in the boat, what's it like? I mean, some people might say that fishing bottom bouncers is maybe a little bit boring. You're not always holding on to the rod or whatever. But, a day of bottom bounce fishing, a lot of times on Devil's Lake or bodies like it just means catching fish. And there's nothing boring about that. I mean, what's your feel on bottom bounce fishing?
Well, actually, bottom bouncers give you a lot of sensitivity, in my opinion. If you hold onto the rod, just the wire on the bottom bouncer transmits everything. That's one of the things I really like about using bottom bouncers, especially later on in the summer. These fish are holding on these really specific transitions, and you can tell where the weeds start and the rock stops. You can tell where big rocks turn to little rocks, where sand transitions into gravel. I mean, you can tell so much if you're holding the rod by what's transmitted up that wire, especially if you're using braided line. And that's what a lot of times what I'm using is just a 10-pound braid. And so you can feel a lot. But, when a fish hits it, a lot of times it just loads up. And a lot of times the hits could be actually really, really hard. That rod will load up, and you'll wonder if you're snagged. And all of a sudden it'll just start to shake and move, and it doesn't take much to set the hook. A lot of times you're just sweeping the rod. But even if the rod's in the rod holder, and a lot of times the rod holder can outfish you, where if you're going fast enough, that bottom bouncer is skimming along the bottom, and you'll just see that rod just load up in the rod holder, and just matter of just picking the rod out of the rod holder and reeling in the fish. And so that's probably why it's so user friendly. It's so flexible. I mean, you can be a really experienced angler and catch a lot of fish with them and enjoy it. You can be a first time angler and look like a rock star. And that's probably why bottom bouncers are so great and wonderful, just for that reason.
I still find it super curious and funny to think about. You look at the bottom bouncer in a spinner, just a spun piece of wire with that lead melted to it, and you look at all the different methods and ways of catching a walleye. The bottom bouncer and spinner, I mean, really, looking back on it, what is the origin story of something so simple that has continued to withstand the test of time? Almost just like pitching a jig in a minnow. You can't get much more simple, but you also can't at times get much better either.
There's a lot of presentations out there that have, become popular, become mainstream. You look at, pitching jigs and live bait rigs and trolling crankbaits, you name it. I think if anything, the bottom bouncer has been really popular in the Dakotas for, decades, several years. And, in his deal where they were born, fishing big reservoirs where these fish moved every day and you had to move around and find them. And one day they might be in 10 feet of water. The next day these fish might be in 25 feet of water. And so that's where the bottom bouncer was born, out of necessity. And obviously, as walleye fishing continue to become popular, the bottom bouncer spinner combination has really bloomed in a lot of different places. But what's funny is that I think there's probably a lot of resistance at first. I mean, I can't tell you how many places where it seemed like there's just a resistance from some anglers where a lot of walleyes, you got to use a light line on a long leader, and you have to use a tiny hook and really good live bait, and it's all live bait rigging. Got the bail open, finger on the line. Fish bites, you count to 10 because these fish are so smart they're going to drop it if they feel you. And that was kind of the mentality in a lot of lakes, especially further east in Minnesota and Wisconsin, on inland water. And I think what's happened over the years is that people have discovered that you can fish for walleyes with finesse, but you can also fish for walleyes much more aggressively, where it's Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, Winnebago. I mean, there's good bottom bouncers and spinner bites, on a lot of different fisheries, all through the summer at different times. And, trolling, mile and a half an hour with a crawler harness behind a bottom bouncer, it's just proven where it just catches fish in a lot of different places. And I think, people are probably slow to warm up to that at first, especially in the age of finesse, especially like in the 80s, but, it's definitely mainstream now. I can't tell you, I can't even begin to imagine how many millions of walleyes have been caught on a bottom bouncer, a spinner, in either a full crawler or a half crawler. I mean, that's bread and butter in a lot of places. So circling back to Devil's Lake, one thing we get all the time, is, especially people who have never fished the lake before, they're maybe unsure of where to go or where to start, is that, it's easy to spend a lot of time on the wrong spot anywhere you go, no matter, how much fishing you do. And the whole key with catching fish, especially in the summer when the water temperatures are warm, the fish have these high metabolisms right now, you got to find fish, and so don't be afraid to just, break down water and find fish and eliminate a lot of spots. Eliminate a lot of spots where, okay, there's no fish here. And that's the whole beauty of using a bottom bouncer and spinner, is that you can just cover so much water until you find fish. And a lot of times once you find them, you'll catch all the fish you want on a bottom bouncer and spinner. But, if you have to change your techniques or change your tactics after you find the fish, that's fine. But, just for simply finding fish, that's just a presentation that's really tough to beat.
All right. Well, I tell you what, I think we've covered the ABCs of bottom bouncer fishing on Devil's Lake. Thank you so much for the time, Jason. I know you're a busy guy on your way to the next one, so we're going to keep this one short and sweet. And, if anybody has any more questions, there's a lot of great articles out there. Jason's published some articles. You can find them on the website, Jason Mitchell Outdoors. Even cruises social medias on Instagram, Facebook, Jason Mitchell Outdoors. YouTube is also a great resource for tips and tactics. There's a lot of bottom bouncer and spinner stuff there too. But anyways, thank you so much for the time, Jason, and we'll let you get back at it.
All right, we'll see you.
We'll talk to you.
You bet. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for following along on another episode of the podcast. Make sure to go to Instagram, Facebook, Jason Mitchell Outdoors, where you can recommend a guest or a topic for an upcoming show. Head on over to YouTube for more Jason Mitchell Outdoors content. And if you're listening on Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts, make sure to hit the subscribe button and share with all your friends.